Adrian Cole grabbed the man by his collar in the middle of his own boardroom and said very quietly, "If you look at her like that again, I will end your career before you finish that sentence." The room went dead silent. 20 executives stopped breathing. Because Adrian Cole never threatened anyone twice. And because every single person in that room had just witnessed the most powerful man in the city lose control not over money, not over power, but because his assistant smiled at another man. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The rain started just after 11. Not the soft kind of rain that makes people nostalgic, the brutal, relentless kind that beats against windows like it has a grudge. Adrian Cole stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of his 42nd floor office and watched the city drown below him, and he felt absolutely nothing. That was normal for him. Feeling nothing was in fact one of his greatest professional assets. He had just finished firing 3 senior executives in a single evening. 3 men who had collectively spent 41 years inside his company, who had families and mortgages and retirement plans, and who had made the catastrophic mistake of thinking that loyalty to the organization meant they were untouchable. They were not untouchable. Nobody was untouchable. Adrian had learned that lesson at 7 years old, sitting across from his father at a dinner table that was always too big and too quiet, and he had never unlearned it. He straightened his cuffs. He picked up his coat. He walked to the elevator. The building was nearly empty at this hour. Security cameras blinked their red eyes in the hallways. A janitor pushed a cart somewhere on the floor below. The elevator descended in silence, and Adrian stood in it the way he stood in most places, like he was the only real thing in the room, and everything else was just furniture. The underground parking garage smelled like concrete and oil and cold air. His car was at the far end, a black vehicle that his driver had left precisely where instructed. Adrian walked toward it with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had never once needed to rush for anything. His footsteps echoed against the low ceiling, and then he heard it. At first he thought it was the rainwater finding a crack in the ceiling somewhere, dripping in uneven rhythms. But it wasn't water. It was breathing. Fractured, desperate breathing, the kind that comes between sobs when someone is trying very hard to keep themselves from falling apart completely and losing the fight. Adrian stopped. He stood completely still in the middle of the garage, and he listened, and he told himself to keep walking. Whatever was happening in this garage was not his problem. He had enough problems. He manufactured problems professionally. He did not need to adopt someone else's. He took one step toward his car. Then he heard her voice. "I can't do this anymore." 3 words. Barely above a whisper. But they carried the specific weight of someone who had been carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time and had just in this cold, empty garage at 11:47 p.m. finally admitted that their arms were giving out. Adrian did not make a decision exactly. His feet simply moved. He followed the sound around the corner of a concrete pillar, past a row of empty parking spaces, until he saw her. Emma Brooks. She was sitting on the floor beside her car, a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper that she'd probably been meaning to fix for months. She had her back against the tire and her knees pulled to her chest, and she was barefoot, her heels placed neatly beside her, as though she'd taken them off, specifically to fall apart more comfortably. Her mascara had made dark rivers down her face. She was holding a stack of papers in both hands, not gripping them, just holding them like they were too heavy to put down, but too painful to keep holding. Adrian recognized her. Of course he did. He made it a point to know every person in his building by name, face, and function. Emma Brooks hired 14 months ago as a project coordinator for the 3rd floor administrative team. Reliable, quiet, never late, never a problem. She hadn't noticed him. Her eyes were fixed on the papers in her hands, and she was talking not to anyone, just talking the way people do when they've run out of options, and prayer feels like their last remaining tool. "The insurance isn't going to cover it," she whispered. "It's not going to cover it, and I don't know how to tell her. She's going to ask, and I don't know what to say." Adrian stood at the edge of the shadow and watched her, and something happened inside his chest that he had absolutely no framework for. Not pity. He'd felt pity before it was a clean emotion manageable. This was something jagged and unfamiliar that scraped against his ribs and refused to be categorized. She lifted her head slightly. Her chin was trembling, and she said very quietly, like she was confessing to the concrete itself, "If I die tomorrow, my daughter will have nobody." The sentence landed in the middle of Adrian Cole's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood there while the ripples spread outward through him, through all that carefully constructed stillness, and reached places inside him that had been sealed shut for so long he'd genuinely forgotten they existed. Emma dropped the papers. They scattered across the concrete floor, and she pressed both hands over her face and cried. Really cried, the full-body, graceless, devastating kind of crying that people only do when they are completely certain they are alone. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in broken pieces. Adrian took one step backward, then another. He walked to his car, got in, and sat in the dark for 4 minutes and 37 seconds without starting the engine. Then he drove home, and for the first time in 11 years, Adrian Cole could not sleep. Emma didn't know he'd seen her. She came to work the next morning exactly as she always did, 7 minutes early, coffee from the place on the corner, hair neat, face composed. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you would never see it. The faint shadows beneath her eyes. The way she held her shoulders slightly too high, like she was bracing for something. The fraction of a second of effort it took her to produce a smile when the receptionist said good morning. Adrian noticed all of it. He noticed because he was watching. And that in itself was new. Adrian Cole did not watch people out of curiosity. He watched people to assess them, to calculate them, to determine their angle. This was different. This was something closer to he rejected the word that came to mind and filed it under things to examine later. By noon, he had learned 3 things he hadn't known the day before. Emma Brooks had worked for his company for 14 months and had not taken a single sick day. She had applied for an emergency medical grant through HR 4 weeks ago and been denied on a technicality. And every day without exception, she ate lunch alone at her desk, not because she was antisocial, but because she was working through lunch. He stood in his office and looked at this information on his screen, and something tightened in his jaw. He called his head of HR. "The medical grant application," he said when she picked up. "The one denied in October, the Brooks application. Pull it." Silence. Then, "Sir, the policy states." "I didn't ask about the policy," Adrian said. "I asked you to pull the file." He hung up. 3 days later, he passed Emma in the hallway outside the conference room. She was carrying an enormous stack of binders and a cup of coffee, and she was doing the particularly impressive physical calculation of a person trying to manage both without dropping either. Adrian stopped. So did she immediately, because in this building when Adrian Cole stopped, everyone stopped. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was steady, professionally, impeccably steady. "Good afternoon. Is that your lunch?" he said. He nodded at the coffee. Emma blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The coffee," he said. "Is that your lunch?" It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer. He'd seen her eat 4 crackers from a sleeve she kept in her desk drawer. The coffee was from the break room, free, because she hadn't gone to the corner place today. Emma's expression did something complicated. She shifted the binders in her arms. "I had a late breakfast," she said. Smooth. Practiced. A lie she'd told before. "Put the binders down," Adrian said. "Excuse me." "The binders. Put them on the table." She stared at him for exactly 2 seconds, then set them on the conference table behind her with a controlled, deliberate movement that told him she did not appreciate being managed, but was too professional to say so. Adrian pulled out his phone. He typed something. "There's a restaurant on the 4th floor of the building across the street," he said without looking up. "I've authorized a standing account. Use it." He handed her the phone so she could see the confirmation. Emma looked at the screen, then at him. Something moved across her face, not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated. Something almost like suspicion. "I'm not," she started. "A business accommodation," he said flatly. "I need my staff functional. You're not functional when you're running on crackers and coffee." He picked up one of her binders, looked at the label Quarterly Compliance Reports, and handed it back to her. "Third floor needs those by 2, he said, and he walked away. He made it approximately 12 feet before he realized his hands were not entirely steady. He put them in his pockets and kept walking. It was the jacket incident that changed things. Not for Emma, she didn't know about it until much later. But for Adrian, it was the moment that cracked something open that he could never quite close again. It was almost 9 p.m. Most of the third floor had gone home. Emma was still at her desk. Adrian had seen her on the security monitor that he absolutely was not checking with any frequency, and she was asleep. Genuinely, head on her arms, completely unconscious, asleep. She'd clearly been fighting it for a while, based on the coffee cups and the 3 open documents on her monitor. She'd lost. Adrian stood in the doorway for a moment. He took off his suit jacket. He walked over to her desk very quietly and laid it over her shoulders. She made a small sound, but didn't wake. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes were deep enough to be architecture built over weeks, maybe months of sleeping too little and worrying too much. He straightened up. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he went back to his office and sat in his chair and stared at the wall, and tried seriously and deliberately to understand what was happening to him. He came up empty. The thing about Emma Brooks Adrian discovered over the following 2 weeks was that she had a specific, devastating quality that he had no word for yet. She showed up, every single day, no matter what was happening, and things were clearly always happening, things that would have crushed other people. She showed up, and she did her job, and she kept going. Not cheerfully, not without cracks. He could see the cracks. He was probably the only person in the building who looked closely enough to see them, but she kept going anyway. He found out about the second job by accident. His driver mentioned in passing that he'd seen Emma outside a restaurant downtown, one of those mid-range places that business travelers stay at, the kind with a bar that stays open until 2 a.m. She'd been in a server's uniform. Adrian said nothing. He dismissed his driver and sat in the back of the car and worked out the arithmetic in his head full-time corporate job, waitressing until close, single-mother medical bills, 14 months of no sick days. His jaw was so tight it ached. He made 3 phone calls that night. None of them were to people Emma would want him to call. By morning, he had a clearer picture of her situation than she probably had herself, and the picture was, it was not acceptable. That was the word his mind kept landing on. Not sad, not unfortunate, not complicated, not acceptable. He was not used to things being not acceptable and remaining that way. Mark. The moment that Adrian Cole stopped pretending even to himself that what he felt for Emma Brooks was purely managerial happened in a conference room on a Tuesday morning during a budget review meeting that had nothing to do with either of them. A senior vice president named Gerald Marsh, overweight, self-important, the kind of man who thought his title was a personality, had asked Emma to get him a coffee. She wasn't there as his assistant. She was presenting data. But she'd been the only woman in the room, and Gerald Marsh was the specific kind of man who operated on the assumption that women in rooms existed to serve him. Emma had not blinked. She'd said very calmly, "I'll let you know where the machine is on your way out," and returned to her presentation. The room went quiet in that particular way it does when something has happened that everyone is simultaneously aware of and pretending not to notice. Gerald Marsh turned red. And then he laughed, the awful dismissive laugh of a man who has never once been told no without recourse, and said, "Somebody's testy today. Maybe leave the big presentations to the professionals, sweetheart." Adrian set down his pen. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply set it down, and the small click of it against the table was enough something in his voice when he spoke, something in the quality of his stillness, to make everyone in the room hold their breath. "Gerald," he said. Marsh turned. He was still smiling. You've been with this company for 12 years, Adrian said. Your performance reviews for the last 3 have been adequate at best. You've billed the company for $17,000 in expenses that I find on review to be personally questionable. He paused. And you just spoke to a member of my staff the way my father used to speak to people he was about to ruin. The smile left Gerald Marsh's face. Clear your office today, Adrian said. HR will have your paperwork by 4. He picked up his pen. He looked back at Emma. Emma was looking at him with an expression he could not read. Not gratitude, not shock. Something more careful than either of those things, like she was trying to solve an equation, and the answer was making her afraid. Continue, he said. She continued. But later, when the meeting ended, when people filed out with the shell-shocked relief of survivors, Emma paused at the door. She turned back. He was still at the table reviewing his notes. Mr. Cole, she said. He looked up. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said carefully, Why did you... The honest answer was something Adrian had not yet found language for. So he said instead, because it was not acceptable. Emma watched him for a moment that lasted long enough to matter. Then she nodded once and left. Adrian sat in the empty conference room and understood with the particular clarity that arrives when a thing has been true for a while and you finally run out of ways to deny it. He understood that he was in serious trouble. The night of the storm changed everything. The weather system had been building all day, the kind that meteorologists get excited about and that everyone else pretends not to worry about. By 7 p.m., the city was wrapped in wind and rain so heavy, the streets had become rivers. The building's operational team was advising all non-essential personnel to shelter in place until conditions improved. Emma was not non-essential. She was apparently in the middle of a client data crisis that required her full and immediate attention, along with Adrian's, and so they had both stayed. They had worked in the same space for 3 hours, her at the secondary workstation, him at his desk. No unnecessary conversation, all business. The specific charged silence of 2 people paying very careful attention to not paying attention to each other. By 10 p.m., the storm had not improved. The client data had been stabilized, and Emma Brooks had fallen asleep on his couch. Not intentionally. She'd sat down at some point during the last hour with a tablet in her hand and her legs tucked under her, and she'd simply gone. The tablet was still in her hand, tilted at an angle that suggested sleep had arrived without warning. Adrian sat at his desk and watched her sleep and did not pretend even for a moment to be working. She looked different sleeping. The efficiency was gone. The careful composure that she wore like body armor, the professional steadiness, the practiced deflection, all of it was gone. She looked tired. She looked young in a way she never looked when she was awake, because when she was awake, she was carrying years that didn't belong on her face. She looked, Adrian thought, like someone who had been alone for a very long time and had simply gotten used to it. He recognized it because he knew what that looked like. He'd been looking at it in mirrors for 15 years. The storm rattled the windows. Rain moved across the glass in sheets. The city below was muffled and distant. And for this exact moment, the only 2 real things in the world were this room and her breathing, and the specific ache in Adrian Cole's chest that had no name yet, but was becoming moment by moment impossible to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, and very quietly to the sleeping woman on his couch, to the rain on the windows, to the city below, that couldn't hear him and wouldn't believe him, he said, "You make this place feel less empty." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Emma slept on undisturbed, and Adrian Cole sat in the dark with the truth of what he'd just said, and the full weight of what it meant, and the absolute certainty that nothing, not his money, not his control, not 15 years of careful construction, had prepared him for this. She woke up alone. The couch was empty of everything except a folded blanket that hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep, and a glass of water on the side table, and a single post-it note that said in handwriting so precise it looked almost mechanical, "Car service arranged. Lobby, 6 a.m. No signature, No explanation. Just the fact of it, the quiet, undeniable fact that someone had covered her while she slept and made sure she had a way home. Emma sat with the blanket in her lap and the note in her hand for a long moment. Then she folded the note, put it in her pocket, and told herself it meant nothing. She was very good at telling herself things meant nothing. She'd had a lot of practice. The car was waiting exactly where the note said it would be. The driver didn't speak unless she spoke first. He dropped her at her apartment building at 6:14 a.m., and when she tried to ask about payment, he simply said, "Already handled, ma'am," with the particular finality of someone who has been instructed not to discuss it further. Emma walked up to her apartment, checked on her daughter still asleep, small and warm and perfect, and stood in her kitchen and drank a glass of water and tried to organize her thoughts into something manageable. The thoughts refused to organize. She kept coming back to the conference room, to Gerald Marsh's face going white, to Adrian's voice not raised, not theatrical, just absolutely terrifyingly certain, saying, "Clear your office today," and then looking at her and saying, "Continue," like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just dismantled a 12-year career in 40 seconds on her behalf. Why did you? Because it was not acceptable. Emma rinsed her glass, set it in the rack, and made a decision she was going to be a professional. She was going to go to work, do her job, and maintain the appropriate distance between herself and the fact that her billionaire employer had noticed her eating crackers for lunch and apparently decided to do something about it. People did things for complicated reasons. She was not going to read into it. She was not going to be the woman who confused power for protection. She had done that once before, and she still had the paperwork to prove how badly that had ended. She was going to be fine. She was absolutely, completely, professionally fine. She lasted 4 days. It was the orange that broke her. Not dramatically, nothing that happened between Emma Brooks and Adrian Cole happened dramatically at first. It was small things, always small things, the kind that accumulate in the spaces between people, like water finding its way through stone. She came to work on Thursday and found an orange on her desk. Not a note, not a card. Just an orange placed precisely in the center of her workspace, where she would definitely see it, because someone had apparently noticed that she never ate breakfast before 9 and that her blood sugar would dip, and she'd press her fingers to her temple at her desk around 8:45 without realizing she was doing it. She picked it up. She looked around the office. Nobody was watching her, or at least nobody she could catch watching her. She ate the orange. She put the peel in the trash and sat down at her desk and thought with the carefully controlled internal panic of a woman who knows exactly what's happening to her and wishes it would stop. This is a problem. Because the orange wasn't the problem. The orange was just fruit. The problem was that somebody, a specific, very particular somebody, had paid enough attention to know she needed it. And Emma Brooks had spent 3 years making herself as invisible as possible, specifically so that nobody would pay that kind of attention to her, because attention had a cost that she could not currently afford to pay. She opened her laptop. She started working. She ate her orange and she worked, and she did not think about it any further. She thought about it constantly. The second week after the storm, Adrian stopped her in the hallway outside the third-floor conference room. Not dramatically, he was walking one direction, she was walking another, and he simply stopped as she passed. And she stopped, because you stopped. When Adrian Cole stopped, it was a physical law of the building, like gravity. "You look tired," he said. Emma stared at him. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Cole." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "Is the second job necessary?" The blood left Emma's face. She recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly. It was a survival skill she'd developed to a professional level, but there was a half-second gap, and she knew he saw it. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "The restaurant on Clement Street," he said. "You close 4 nights a week. You've been doing it for 8 months. Emma set her jaw. She kept her voice exactly level. "With respect, Mr. Cole, that is my personal business. It's affecting your performance." "My performance reviews have been excellent," he said. "Every single one. Which is more remarkable than you probably realize, given that you're running on 4 hours of sleep and doing the work of 3 people." He paused. I'm not criticizing you, Emma. It was the first time he had ever used her first name. The hallway felt slightly different after that. Smaller, more pressurized somehow, like the air had shifted. "What are you doing then?" she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her for a moment. And then he said something she didn't expect. "I'm trying to figure out how to help without making it worse." Emma blinked. Adrian held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. She counted involuntarily, and then he nodded once and walked away. Emma stood in the hallway and breathed and told herself again very firmly that she was not going to be that woman. She was not going to be the woman who fell for a powerful man because he noticed her. She had a daughter to raise and bills to pay, and a life that she had clawed back from the wreckage of her marriage with her bare hands, and she was not going to complicate it. She was not going to be foolish. She was not going to think about the way he'd said, "I'm trying to figure out how to help without making it worse," like it was something he'd been turning over for days. She was definitely not going to think about that. She thought about it the entire rest of the day. What happened next arrived the way most significant things do, sideways disguised as something ordinary. A Friday afternoon 3 weeks after the storm, Emma was at her desk running end-of-week reports when her phone buzzed. Not her work phone, her personal cell. She looked at the screen and felt the particular cold that settles in a person's chest when they see a name they were hoping never to see again. Daniel, her ex-husband. She let it ring. It went to voicemail. She looked at the voicemail notification for 30 seconds, then put the phone face down on her desk and returned to her spreadsheet. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands for being steady. The voicemail, when she finally listened to it in the parking garage, a different spot this time, deliberately nowhere near the column where she'd fallen apart 6 weeks ago, lasted 43 seconds. Daniel's voice was pleasant in that specific way of people who have decided to be pleasant because pleasant is more threatening than angry. He said he'd heard she was doing well. He said he was glad. He said he'd been thinking about their arrangement regarding Sophie, and he thought it might be time to revisit some of the terms, and he'd really appreciate a conversation, and she could call him back whenever was convenient. Emma played it twice. Then she sat in her car for a while. The arrangement regarding Sophie was a custody agreement that had taken 11 months and most of her savings to negotiate, and it was the thing she was most afraid of in the world, not losing it exactly, but the fact that it was never truly safe, that it existed in the specific vulnerable space of things that powerful men could reach if they wanted to. Daniel wasn't powerful in the way Adrian was powerful. He was powerful in the smaller, meaner way of a man who understood exactly what someone else was most afraid of losing. She drove home. She read Sophie her favorite book twice, which was one more time than usual. She tucked her in and sat on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep and looked at her small, sleeping face and felt the specific terror of a woman who would burn the world down to keep this one small person safe and had absolutely no idea how. The next morning, Adrian noticed immediately. She knew he would. She'd already established with reluctant certainty that Adrian Cole noticed things about her that she hadn't told anyone. This was both the most unsettling and she was ashamed to admit the most inexplicably comforting fact of her recent life. She was walking to the break room when he fell into step beside her. He didn't announce it. He just appeared the way he apparently did everything without preamble, without ceremony. "What happened?" he said. Emma glanced at him. "Nothing happened." "Something happened." "I'm fine." "You've said good morning to 4 people this morning," he said. "You're always the first person to say good morning. Today you haven't said it to anyone." Emma stopped walking. She turned to look at him. There was something genuinely disorienting about being known this specifically by someone who was supposed to be essentially a stranger, and the disorientation came out sideways as a kind of frustration. "Do you do this with all your employees?" she asked. "Count how many times they say good morning." "No," he said, simply, without apology. They looked at each other in the hallway. Emma said quietly, "It's personal." "Okay," he said. And then, after a beat, "I'm good at personal problems." "You have a reputation for the opposite." "I know." He paused. "That doesn't mean I'm bad at them. It means I usually don't care enough to try. He looked at her steadily. I'm trying. Emma held his gaze. She felt the thing she'd been carefully not feeling for 6 weeks, pushing at the edges of her composure, finding the cracks which were everywhere today, because she was tired and scared, and had listened to Daniel's voicemail 4 times now, and understood with the sinking certainty of experience that the pleasant voice meant he had something to threaten her with, and was deciding when to use it. My ex-husband called, she said, because she was tired, and because he was looking at her like the truth was not going to break him, and because she was, despite everything, desperately human. He wants to revisit custody. Adrian was still for a moment. Is he likely to pursue it? He said. He only pursues things when he thinks he'll win, she said, which means he thinks he has something. What could he have? Emma looked away, then back. He's been watching me. He watches everything Daniel does. He's very patient. If he found out I've been struggling financially, if he has documentation of anything that looks like instability. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I can't lose her. I can't. She is the only thing that I... Her voice fractured just for a second, just a hairline fracture barely audible. She pulled it back. Adrian said nothing. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't rush to fix it with words, didn't make the particular mistake of speaking when what was required was silence. He just stood there, and his presence was infuriatingly steadying. I have a lawyer, he said finally. Emma blinked. I can't afford. Not for you to hire, he said. She works for me. She's handled custody cases. If Daniel files anything, or if he contacts you again with any kind of implied threat, I want you to call her. He pulled out a card from his jacket pocket. He'd apparently been carrying it already, which meant he'd thought about this already, which meant he'd known she was carrying something before she'd told him and held it out. Emma looked at the card, then at him. Adrian, she said, his name for the first time. It came out before she could stop it. He didn't react to it, outwardly. But something shifted in his eyes, something careful and warm, and quickly contained. Take the card, Emma, he said quietly. She took it. They stood in the hallway for a moment that went slightly longer than was professional, and then Adrian nodded once and walked in the direction he'd come from, and Emma stood and held the card in both hands and understood with the resigned clarity of someone losing an argument they've been having with themselves for weeks that she was in very serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble she was afraid of. A different kind. The kind that comes when someone sees you, really sees you past the competence and the composure and the carefully maintained professional armor and doesn't look away. The kind that comes when someone says, I'm trying and means it, and you believe them, and believing them feels like standing at the edge of something very high and discovering that you're not as afraid of falling as you thought you were. She put the card in her pocket, next to the post-it note which she still hadn't thrown away. She went back to her desk and worked, and around 4 p.m, her direct supervisor called her into a meeting to discuss a project reassignment. And the reassignment turned out to be a promotion, lateral title. 20% salary increase, effective immediately, framed as organizational restructuring. And Emma sat across from her supervisor and nodded professionally and asked the appropriate questions, and the entire time she was aware at a frequency she couldn't tune out that the timing was too specific to be accidental. She didn't confront him about it. She thought about it. She stood outside his office door at 5:30 p.m. with the intention of confronting him about it because she was not a charity case and she was not going to be managed like a problem to be solved, and she needed him to understand that. She raised her hand to knock. Then she heard through the door Adrian's voice. Not to her, to someone on the phone, saying with the particular controlled tension of a man who is rarely in danger of losing his temper, and is currently very close to losing his temper. If you contact her again with anything that implies a legal threat, I will personally introduce your attorney to a discovery process that will make the last 4 years of your professional life extremely uncomfortable. Am I clear? A pause. Good, Adrian said, and then quieter almost to himself. Nobody is taking that child from her. Emma's hand was still raised, poised to knock. She lowered it. She stood outside the door for another moment, and something happened inside her chest that was simultaneously terrifying and the warmest thing she'd felt in 3 years. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and stood in the hallway and breathed and tried to get a hold of herself and mostly failed. Then she straightened her spine. She adjusted her jacket. She walked to the elevator. She was going home to her daughter. She was going to cook dinner and help with homework and read the book twice, same as always. Everything was the same, except that somewhere in the last 6 weeks without her permission, something had shifted. Something that was going to be very, very hard to shift back. And the man in the office behind her, the one who'd just threatened her ex-husband on her behalf and called it nobody's business, was sitting at his desk with his phone in his hand, looking at nothing in particular, feeling something he hadn't felt since before his father died and his empire was built, and all the warmth went out of his life like a door closing. He was feeling for the first time in 15 years like something might actually be worth protecting. Not a company, not a reputation, her. She didn't say thank you. Adrian didn't expect her to. What he hadn't expected was what she did instead, which was come to work the following Monday with a container of homemade food that she left on his assistant's desk with a note that said simply, "For Mr. Cole." From the break room microwave incident. There had been no break room microwave incident. It was a fiction, a professional cover story, a way of giving something back without making it a thing that had to be acknowledged or discussed. Adrian read the note twice. He looked at the container. Some kind of rice dish, still warm, smelled like something his housekeeper had never once made, and he understood exactly what she was doing and why. And something in his chest did a thing he didn't have vocabulary for. He ate it at his desk, alone, in silence. It was the best meal he'd had in longer than he could honestly remember, not because of the food, but because of the specific weight of a gesture made by someone who had nothing to spare and gave it anyway. He did not thank her. She would have hated that. Instead, he sent an interdepartmental memo authorizing flexible scheduling for all third-floor project coordinators, effective immediately, citing operational efficiency. Emma would understand. She understood everything he did, which was becoming its own specific problem. The problem arrived in full that Wednesday, in the form of a man named Carter Blythe. Carter Blythe was 34, worked in business development on the 6th floor. Had the particular easy confidence of someone who had always been good-looking and had never been required to develop much beyond that. He was by all objective measures a perfectly acceptable human being. He'd done nothing wrong. Adrian had reviewed his file, not that he'd been looking for reasons, he just happened to review it, and Carter Blythe had decent reviews, no disciplinary record, and had recently transferred from the Chicago office. He was also apparently funny. Adrian became aware of this fact at 11:23 a.m. on a Wednesday when he walked past the open door of the third-floor kitchenette and heard Emma laugh. He stopped. Not a polite laugh. Not the professional closed-mouth acknowledgement of a joke that wasn't particularly funny, but required some response. A real laugh, unguarded, surprised out of her, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and undefended. And she was smiling at Carter Blythe, with the specific ease of someone who had for a few seconds forgotten to be careful. Adrian stood outside that door for 4 seconds. Then he walked away. He went to his office. He sat down. He looked at his screen and read the same sentence 7 times without processing a single word. The sentence was about quarterly projections. He couldn't have told you what the projections were. He called his assistant in. "Cancel my 2 o'clock, he said. "Sir, that's the Henderson. Reschedule it." His assistant left. Adrian stood at his window with his hands in his pockets and looked at the city below and had a very honest conversation with himself. The conversation went approximately like this: what he was feeling was jealousy. He was aware that it was jealousy. He was also aware that he had absolutely no claim on Emma Brooks. No right, no standing. Nothing that would justify what was currently happening to his ability to function professionally. Emma had not done anything wrong. She had laughed at someone's joke in the break room. This was a normal human activity. She was allowed to do it. She was allowed to do it with anyone she wanted. The conversation was not making him feel better. He was still at the window when his assistant buzzed through. "Mr. Cole, Emma Brooks is asking if you have 10 minutes. She says it's about the Hartley account." Adrian turned from the window. "Send her in." Emma came in with a tablet and the expression of a person conducting normal business, which she absolutely was, because to her knowledge, nothing unusual had happened today. She sat in the chair across from his desk and pulled up a file and started talking about the Hartley account, which was a real account with real issues that genuinely required attention. Adrian watched her talk and said the appropriate things and gave the appropriate direction and he was fairly certain, completely professional throughout. He was almost certain. Because at one point, Emma looked up from her tablet and said mid-sentence, "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said. "Continue." She looked at him for a moment with those careful eyes that missed nothing. Then she looked back at her tablet. "The discrepancy in the third quarter filing is about 40,000, she said. "I think it's a data entry error, but I wanted to flag it before—" "Emma." She looked up. "The man in the kitchenette," he said. "This morning." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was enough time for Emma's expression to cycle through something complicated, surprise recognition, and then a careful, deliberate neutrality that told him she understood exactly what he was asking and was deciding how to answer it. "Carter," she said. "He's in business development." "I know who he is. He was telling me about the time he got stuck in an elevator for 4 hours with a mime." A pause. "It was funny. I'm sure it was." Emma set her tablet down on her knee. She looked at him with the particular directness that she reserved for moments when she'd decided the professional fiction wasn't worth maintaining. "Adrian," she said. "His name again." It still did the same thing to the air in the room. "What are you asking me?" He held her gaze. "Nothing," he said. "That's not true." He said nothing. Emma said quietly, "You don't have the right to ask." And she was correct. Completely, unambiguously correct, and they both knew it. He had not said anything to her. He had given her food and a lawyer's card and a salary increase wrapped in a memo about operational efficiency, and none of those things constituted a declaration, and none of them gave him any standing to feel what he was currently feeling about the sound of her laughing at another man's joke. "You're right," he said. Emma blinked. She'd clearly expected an argument. The agreement disarmed her. "I don't," he said, "have the right. I'm aware of that." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but changed. Like a door that had been firmly closed had moved just slightly on its hinges. "The Hartley discrepancy," she said, finally picking her tablet back up. "Do you want me to pull the original entries or start with the reconciliation report?" "Reconciliation," he said. She nodded. She kept working. Neither of them mentioned it again. But when she left 40 minutes later, she paused at the door, and she turned back, and she said without looking directly at him, "It was just a joke about a mime, Adrian. That's all it was." Then she left. Adrian sat in his office for a long time after that. He thought about the fact that she'd told him, that she hadn't had to, and she'd told him anyway. And he thought about what it meant, that knowing it, that it was nothing, that it was just a laugh, that it didn't mean what his chest had convinced him it meant, immediately made the tight, wretched thing in his chest release like a fist unclenching. He understood now profoundly and completely in over his head. The twist he hadn't seen coming arrived 11 days later. Emma had been slightly different since the conversation in his office. Not colder, if anything, there was less performance in how she moved around him, less of the careful professional choreography she usually maintained. She was more present. She looked at him directly when she spoke. She disagreed with him in meetings, which she had always done, but now did without the fractional hesitation that suggested she was calculating the risk first. She brought him coffee exactly once unrequested, set it on his desk without comment, and left before he could respond. He found himself engineering reasons to be on the 3rd floor. He reviewed this behavior with the same unflinching clarity he applied to everything, concluded it was not admirable, and continued doing it anyway. It was on one of these not admirable third-floor visits that he overheard the conversation that changed everything. He wasn't eavesdropping. He was walking past a conference room with a partially open door, and the voices carried, and he heard his own name before he could make the decision to keep moving. "Cole's been down here 3 times this week." This was a voice he didn't recognize. Female, mid-level speculative. "People are talking. People always talk." Emma's voice, flat controlled. "Emma, come on. The salary bump, the scheduling thing, the Marsh incident. He treats his staff well. It's a management style." "A management style." The other voice was amused. "Okay, and the jacket." A pause. "What jacket?" "Security footage. 3 weeks ago. You were asleep at your desk and he—" "Stop." Emma's voice had changed. Not angry, careful in a new way. "Stop right there. I'm not saying anything bad, I'm just—" "He's my employer," Emma said. Quiet. Absolute. "That's the whole thing. That's all of it. And I need it to stay that way because I cannot afford for it to be anything else. Do you understand I have Sophie and I have custody that is currently not as secure as I need it to be, and if there is any story at all about me, and a man I work for, Daniel, will use it. He will absolutely use it. So whatever people are talking about, I need you to shut it down. Please." Silence. "Okay," the other voice said softly. "Okay, Em, I get it." Adrian had stopped walking. He stood outside the conference room door and listened to Emma say the thing she was most afraid of out loud, and he understood with a clarity that was almost physical exactly how impossible his position was. Not impossible because she didn't feel anything he was nearly certain now that she did. Impossible because everything he was, everything he represented, his power, his name, his visibility, was precisely the thing that endangered her most. The thing she needed protection from was structurally him. Not because he would hurt her, but because the world around him would simply by association. He walked back to the elevator. He rode up to his floor. He sat at his desk and looked at his hands and understood for the first time what it felt like to have everything and be unable to use any of it. He stayed in that feeling for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, Emma walked into his office at 8 a.m., closed the door behind her, and put a resignation letter on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at her. She was wearing the expression of someone who has made a very difficult decision and is holding on to it with both hands because she knows if she loosens her grip, she'll reconsider. Her chin was steady. Her eyes were not. "Emma," he said. "I've secured a position at another firm," she said. "The notice period is 2 weeks, but I'm prepared to train a replacement, and I'll have all current projects. Look at me." She was already looking at him. She didn't look away. "I've given this a lot of thought," she said. "It's the right decision for my family." "Is it what you want?" Her jaw tightened. "What I want isn't." "Is it what you want?" he said again. The silence lasted long enough to be an answer. Adrian stood up. He came around the desk, not toward her. He stopped several feet away. He was very deliberate about the distance, and he said, "You're running." "I'm making a practical decision." "You heard something," he said. "Someone said something to you, or you found out that people are talking and you're running before it can become a problem." Emma's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "It's already a problem, Adrian. That's the point. I cannot be a story. My daughter cannot be collateral damage in whatever this—" She gestured between them, her hand unsteady for the first time. "Whatever this is. I don't even know what this is." "Then let me tell you," he said. "Don't." Sharp. Immediate. "Don't say something that makes this harder. It's going to be harder if you leave. It's going to be impossible if I stay." They were looking at each other across the distance he'd deliberately put between them, and the air in the room had the specific charge of something that had been building for months and was now finally fully pressurized. Adrian said quietly, "I'm not going to touch your custody case. I'm not going to make you a story. I'm not going to make you a target. He paused. But I need you to know that whatever I've been doing for the last 2 months, the card, the lawyer, the account across the street, none of it was a strategy. None of it was me trying to own something or control something. I heard you in that parking garage and I couldn't. He stopped. Emma's eyes had changed. You heard me, she said, very quietly. Yes. The word landed between them like a stone. Emma's breath came out slow and uneven. How much did you hear? Enough, he said. I heard enough. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She turned away from him toward the window. He could see her shoulders working the specific controlled movement of someone who will not cry in front of another person who has spent years building the discipline not to. Emma, he said, give me a second. Her voice was muffled behind her hand. He gave her the second. He gave her several. He stood in his office and waited, and the waiting, the stillness, the choosing not to fill the silence with words that might make him feel better, but would only crowd her. This was possibly the hardest thing he'd done in years. She turned back. Her eyes were bright, but her face was composed. She lowered her hand. You should have told me, she said. I know. Instead, you just watched and arranged things, and I didn't know why. I know, he said again. She looked at him for a long, unguarded moment, and then she said something that hit him somewhere completely undefended. Men with power always think they can fix things by moving them around, like people or furniture. Like if they just arrange it right, it'll be okay. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were saying something else entirely. My ex-husband thought that too. The silence after that was absolute. Adrian felt those words go into him like a blade finding a seam, finding the exact gap in the armor, the specific place where the thing he'd been most afraid to see about himself was waiting to be seen. Because he had been moving things around. The account, the salary, the lawyer, the memo. All of it efficient, all of it effective, all of it decided unilaterally by a man who was so accustomed to solving problems that he'd forgotten to ask if he was one. You're right, he said. Emma blinked. You're right, he said again. I did that. I arranged things without asking you. I decided what you needed and provided it, and called it help, and I didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't ask. I never asked. The room was very quiet. What would you have asked? Emma said. Her voice had changed. The edge was still there, but there was something underneath it now. Something that was listening. Adrian looked at her directly, with the specific honesty of a man who has run out of armor and finds to his own surprise that he doesn't miss it. I would have asked if you were okay, he said. And then I would have actually waited to hear the answer instead of assuming I already knew it. A beat. And I would have asked if you wanted any of it, the help, the all of it. Emma was very still. Do you, he said, want any of it? The question sat in the air between them. Not about salary adjustments or lawyers or restaurant accounts. About all of it. The totality of what had been building unnamed between two people who had both been alone for long enough to have forgotten that this specific terrifying thing was possible. Emma looked at the resignation letter on his desk. Then she looked at him, and she said so quietly he almost missed it, I don't know yet. That's okay, he said immediately. And he meant it. That's Emma, that's completely okay. She nodded once. She picked up the resignation letter from his desk. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. Not withdrawn, not submitted, just held. I need some time, she said. Take it, he said. She walked to the door. She opened it. And then she paused, hand on the frame back to him, and she said, the parking garage. That night. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I was completely alone. I know, he said. I'm glad you stayed, she said. And then she was gone, and Adrian Cole stood in his office with the specific unfamiliar sensation of a man who has just been cracked open, not by loss, not by damage, but by the completely unexpected mercy of being told the truth, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Outside his window, the city moved on, indifferent and enormous. Inside him, something that had been sealed shut for 15 years was quietly and irrevocably beginning to open. The time she asked for lasted 4 days. Adrian gave it to her without touching it. No oranges on her desk. No interdepartmental memos with obvious subtext. No engineered reasons to be on the 3rd floor. He went about his week with the disciplined normalcy of a man who had made a promise to himself and intended to keep it, and if the discipline cost him something, and it did, it cost him considerably, then that was the appropriate price for having spent 2 months deciding things on her behalf without asking. He saw her twice in those 4 days. Once in the elevator where they rode 11 floors together in a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but had the specific texture of 2 people who have said true things to each other and haven't yet decided what to do with the truth. She looked at the elevator doors. He looked at the elevator doors. When she got off on 3, she said, "Good morning," and he said, "Good morning," and the doors closed, and he stood in the elevator alone and exhaled slowly. The second time was in the lobby on Thursday afternoon, when he was coming in from a meeting and she was going out, and they almost collided at the revolving door. She grabbed his arm to stop herself from losing her balance, and they were close, genuinely close, close enough that he could see the small gold flecks in her eyes that he'd been pretending not to notice for months, and she said breathlessly, "Sorry, and he said, "It's fine." And then neither of them moved for approximately 2 seconds longer than was necessary, and then she said, "I have to catch the 3:15 bus." And she went, and Adrian stood in the lobby and watched her go, and thought with remarkable calm, for a man who was currently experiencing something very close to emotional freefall, she takes the bus. He had his driver waiting for him outside. He had 3 cars in the private garage. He had never once thought about the fact that Emma Brooks took the 3:15 bus. He thought about it now. He thought about her standing at a bus stop in the cold with those medical bills in her bag, and that resignation letter folded in her pocket, and the weight of everything she carried alone, and the thinking was not useful. He'd already agreed with himself not to arrange things without asking. But the feeling underneath it was something he was beginning to understand was simply what caring felt like when you stopped managing it. Messy, persistent, completely indifferent to whether it was convenient. The call came on Friday morning at 7:42 a.m. Not from Emma. From a hospital, St. Catherine's Medical Center, which was 11 blocks from Emma's apartment. The call came to his personal cell, which meant someone had gotten his personal number, which meant something had happened that required the kind of access most people didn't have. The someone was Emma's neighbor, a woman named Rosa, who was apparently the person Emma left Sophie with when she worked nights. Rosa's voice was very calm in the way of people who have decided that panicking won't help, and she explained that Sophie's 7-year-old Emma's daughter had been brought to the ER the previous night with a high fever that had progressed to something more serious, and Emma had been there all night, and she hadn't slept. And Rosa thought that someone who could actually help should probably know. "How did you get this number?" Adrian asked. "Emma had it in her emergency contacts," Rosa said. "She put it there about 3 weeks ago and told me never to use it unless something was actually wrong." Adrian was already standing up and reaching for his coat. "I'm on my way," he said. "She's going to be upset that I called," Rosa said. "Probably," Adrian said. "Thank you." He hung up. He thought about Emma 3 weeks ago, quietly adding his personal number to her emergency contacts and telling her neighbor not to use it unless something was actually wrong. He thought about what it meant that she'd done it at all. He put on his coat and walked out of his office and got in the car and did not think about what he was going to say when he got there, because there was no preparing for this kind of thing he was beginning to understand. You just went. The hospital was exactly what hospitals always were. Adrian moved through it with the efficient certainty of a man who knew how to move through difficult environments, spoke to the desk, got the room number, and found Emma in a small family waiting area outside the pediatric ward. She was in the same clothes she'd worn to work on Thursday. She had a paper coffee cup in both hands that was clearly cold, and she hadn't slept. He could see it in every line of her, the specific flatness that comes after a night of being too scared to close your eyes. She looked up when he walked in, and the expression that crossed her face was so complex and so unguarded that it took his breath away. Relief and embarrassment and gratitude and the particular pride of a woman who didn't want anyone to see her like this and was too exhausted to maintain the performance. "Rosa called you," she said. "She did," he said. "I told her only if it was actually, 'Your daughter is in the hospital, Emma.'" She closed her mouth. She looked down at her coffee cup. "She's going to be okay," she said, and her voice only fractured slightly on the last word. It was a bacterial infection. They caught it. She's on antibiotics, and they said by morning she should... She stopped. She breathed. "She's okay." "Good," Adrian said. And then he sat down next to her, not across from her, next to her in the chair directly beside hers, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else required right now, except for someone to be next to her. Emma looked at him sitting beside her. She seemed to be running some kind of internal calculation. Then she gave up on the calculation and leaned very slightly so that her shoulder was against his arm. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was the small, exhausted gesture of someone who had been holding themselves up alone for a very long time and had for this one moment decided to let something share the weight. Adrian did not move. He sat completely still and let her lean and stared at the middle distance and felt something in his chest so large and so quiet that he had no idea what to call it. They sat like that for 40 minutes. Then a nurse came to tell Emma she could go in, and Emma stood up and straightened her jacket, and then she looked at Adrian with those completely undefended eyes, and she said, "Do you want to come?" He stood up. "Yes," he said. Sophie was small in the hospital bed, 7 years old, with Emma's eyes and dark hair spread across the pillow and the specific fragility of a sick child that makes every adult in the vicinity feel the immediate and primitive need to do something. She was awake barely, and when Emma came in she reached out her arms, and Emma sat on the edge of the bed and held her. And Adrian stood in the doorway and watched a woman love her child with the totality of her whole self. And he thought, this is the thing. This is the specific thing he'd seen glimpses of for months. This is what he'd been trying to understand. Emma Brooks was not defined by her exhaustion, or her bills, or her failed marriage, or her composure, or her crackers at her desk. She was defined by this. By the fierceness with which she loved this small person. By the fact that everything, every extra shift, every skipped lunch, every carefully maintained professional performance was in service of making sure this child was safe. Sophie looked past her mother's shoulder and saw Adrian. Her eyes were glassy with fever, but alert, with the particular sharpness of a child who notices more than adults expect. "Who's that?" she said. Emma turned. A complicated expression moved across her face. "He's a friend," she said. "From where I work." Sophie looked at Adrian with 7-year-old directness. "Why did he come to the hospital?" Adrian crouched down so he was at eye level with the bed. "Because your mom was here alone," he said, "and that didn't seem right." Sophie considered this. "Do you have juice?" she said. "The hospital juice tastes like plastic." Adrian looked at Emma. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, and he realized she was trying not to smile, and the smile, when it broke through anyway, was the most undefended thing he'd ever seen on her face. "I'll get you juice," he said to Sophie. He got the juice. He also got crackers. A stuffed rabbit from the gift shop downstairs that he handed to Sophie without ceremony, and 2 actual meals from the cafe, one for Emma, one for himself, which he brought back to the room and set on the tray table without comment. Emma looked at the food and then at him and said, "You didn't have to." "I know," he said. And this time, she didn't argue. They stayed for 3 hours. Sophie fell asleep holding the stuffed rabbit. Emma ate the food and had actual color in her face by the end of it. At some point, she said quietly, "She's never been this sick before. I was so scared." And Adrian said, "I know." And Emma said, "You keep saying that." And he said, "Because it keeps being true." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "When Rosa called you, how fast did you come?" Immediately, he said. Emma nodded slowly. She looked at Sophie sleeping. Then she said very quietly the words so careful they were almost architectural. I've been thinking about what you said. About asking instead of assuming. She paused. Nobody has ever said that to me before. The men in my life, they either didn't care enough to pay attention, or they paid attention and then used it. There wasn't a third option. Adrian was quiet. I didn't know there was a third option, she said. There is, he said. She looked at him. I'm seeing that. The moment held. And then Sophie stirred, and Emma turned to her daughter, and the moment passed. But it left something behind, a specific shift in the air between them. A door that had been moving on its hinges for weeks, that had now finally opened enough to let light through. Adrian drove Emma home that night. He asked first. She said yes. She said. In the car, they were quiet for most of it. Not the pressurized silence of before. Not the careful, professional silence of the elevator, just quiet. Comfortable in a way that surprised both of them. At a red light, Emma said without looking at him. She liked the rabbit. She asked me if it had a name, he said. I told her that was her decision. Emma smiled. He could see it in profile. What did she name it? She was asleep before she decided. Emma laughed, softly, genuinely. And Adrian held that sound carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile, and drove. He walked her to her door. This was not something he'd planned. He'd intended to stay in the car, but somehow when she got out, he got out too, and she didn't say anything about it, which he took as permission. At her door she turned, and they were close again the way they'd been in the lobby, close enough to matter. Thank you, she said. For today. You put me in your emergency contacts, he said. That means something. Emma's chin tilted slightly. It means I was being practical. Emma! She held his gaze. It means something, she admitted quietly. He nodded. He took one step back, giving her the space the way he'd been giving her space for weeks, because that was the thing he'd learned, that the most important thing he could do for this woman was to stop filling all the space and let her decide how much of it she wanted to give him. She watched him step back. And then she did something he did not anticipate at all. She stepped forward, one step deliberate and clear-eyed, and she kissed him. Not desperately, not the kind of kiss that's about losing control, the kind that's about making a choice. Steady and certain and quiet, and it lasted long enough to be a statement. And when she pulled back, she was looking at him with those direct, unguarded eyes, and he could see she was slightly terrified and completely resolved at the same time. Adrian stood very still. He felt the specific stillness of a man who has been struck by something he didn't see coming and is trying to understand if it was real. Okay, he said. His voice came out lower than usual. Okay, Emma said. They looked at each other in the dark outside her door. Sophie gets discharged tomorrow morning, Emma said. Her voice was almost normal except for the slight unevenness in it. I know, he said. I'd like to drive you, if you want. Okay, she said again. Okay, he said. She went inside. He stood at the door for a moment after it closed, and the night was cold, and the street was quiet. And Adrian Cole stood on a sidewalk outside an apartment building in a neighborhood he'd never been to before, and felt moving through him like something enormous and unhurried, the specific sensation of a life beginning to look different than it had looked before. Not better because of money, not better because of power, better because a woman with direct eyes and a daughter who needed juice that didn't taste like plastic had kissed him on her doorstep and said, okay, and okay was the most real thing anyone had ever given him. He walked back to the car. He was almost there when his phone rang. Not Rosa this time, not Emma. His board chairman, Richard Hale, calling at 10:48 p.m. on a Friday, which meant only one thing. Something was wrong, and it was the kind of wrong that didn't wait for Monday. Richard, he said. We need to talk, Hale said. His voice had the specific quality of someone delivering news they've been sitting on. There's been a disclosure. Someone inside the company has been talking to your investors. A pause. It's about Emma Brooks. Adrian stopped walking. The night was very quiet. What about her? He said. His voice was completely steady, the specific steadiness of a man who has just felt the ground shift under his feet and is deciding in real time how to stand. Everything, Hale said. The salary adjustment, the legal referral, the hospital today, someone saw your car. Adrian, they're building a narrative. Misuse of company resources, inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, questionable financial decisions. A beat. They're calling a board meeting. Tuesday. Adrian stood on the sidewalk outside Emma's building with his phone in his hand, and he looked up at the window on the third floor where the light was still on, where she was probably checking on Sophie's discharge paperwork, or drinking tea, or doing one of the 1,000 quiet things she did to hold her life together. And he understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the thing he'd been most afraid of had just happened. Not to him, to her. His name attached to hers, in a story being told by people with something to gain from telling it, was the exact weapon her ex-husband needed. The exact thing she'd told her coworker she couldn't afford. The exact thing she'd been protecting herself from since the beginning. And it had happened anyway. Because of him. Adrian, Hale said. Are you there? I'm here, he said. What do you want to do? Adrian looked at the light in the window one more moment. Then he turned and walked to his car, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were very clear, and the specific cold that moved through him was not the cold of a man who was afraid, it was the cold of a man who understood exactly what the next several days were going to require of him, and had already decided to pay the price. Set up the meeting, he said. And Richard, tell them I'll be there. Tell them I have something to say. He got in the car. He sat in the dark for a moment. And then he did the thing he should have done at the beginning, the thing that no amount of arranging or managing or protecting from a distance could substitute for. He picked up his phone and called Emma. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful. Adrian. Something's happened, he said. I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else. He paused. And I need to ask you something. A beat of silence. Ask me, she said. How much do you trust me? He said. Right now. As of tonight. Honestly. The silence lasted 3 seconds. He counted. More than I should probably admit, she said. That's enough, he said. I'm going to need it. He told her everything, not in the careful, edited way he'd been communicating with her for months. The memos with subtext, the gestures with plausible deniability. The truth delivered sideways because the direct route felt too exposed. He told her all of it. The board meeting. Richard Hale's call. The narrative being constructed by people who had something to gain from his removal and had found in Emma Brooks the most efficient lever available. He told her that his name attached to hers was now a story, and the story was already moving, and Daniel would almost certainly hear it within 48 hours if he hadn't already. Emma listened without interrupting. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady, measured, the specific controlled rhythm of a woman who is processing something frightening and refusing to let it process her. When he finished, she said, Who leaked it? I don't know yet, he said. I will. Is it going to affect custody? He paused one beat because she deserved honesty, not comfort. It could, he said. If Daniel moves fast and frames it the right way. I have the lawyer on it already. She's been monitoring his communications since the first call. If he files anything, we'll know before it lands. A silence. Then, you've been monitoring his communications. Yes. Since when? Since the voicemail, he said. Another silence, longer this time. He waited. He'd learned finally how to wait. I should be angry about that, Emma said. You're allowed to be. I know I'm allowed. I'm trying to figure out if I actually am. A beat. I'm not. I don't know what that says about me. It says you're exhausted, and you're scared, and someone is on your side for the first time in a long time, Adrian said. And that's disorienting. It doesn't have to mean anything else right now. She exhaled. "What do you need from me for Tuesday?" "Nothing," he said immediately. "You stay out of it. You go get Sophie in the morning, you take her home, you keep your routine exactly as it is. The board meeting is my problem. You are not my problem that came out wrong." "I know what you meant," she said. And somehow improbably he could hear that she was almost smiling. "Go to sleep, Emma," he said. "You too," she said. He didn't sleep. He sat at his desk at home and worked until 4 a.m., going through 3 years of board communications, financial records, partnership agreements, and the specific painstaking documentation of every decision he'd made regarding Emma Brooks. Not to defend himself, he was beyond caring about self-defense. To understand exactly what ammunition the other side had and what they intended to do with it, because a man who knows what's coming can decide how to meet it, and Adrian Cole had always preferred to choose his ground. By morning, he knew who had leaked. It was a man named Philip Graves, a board member of 9 years, a man Adrian had promoted twice, and trusted with partnership negotiations that were worth conservatively $400 million. The same negotiations Adrian now understood that he'd recently declined to complete because the other party had wanted terms that would have required falsifying environmental compliance data. Graves had a significant personal stake in those terms going through. Adrian had refused, and Graves apparently had decided that removing Adrian was the more efficient solution. Emma was not the target. She was the weapon. Adrian sat with this information and felt something move through him that was cold and precise and completely clear. Not rage. Rage was imprecise. Rage cost you things. Something cleaner than rage. The specific, focused clarity of a man who has just seen the full shape of what's happening and knows exactly what it requires. He made 6 phone calls before 8 a.m. His personal attorney, his chief financial officer, the SEC compliance officer he'd worked with on 2 previous matters, an investigative journalist at the financial desk of a publication that Philip Graves read every morning with his coffee, and 2 board members who had over 9 years shown him what actual loyalty looked like. He was building something, not a defense, a reckoning. He picked Emma up at 9. They drove to St. Catharines and got Sophie together, and Sophie came out of the hospital wearing a paper crown that a nurse had made for her, and carrying the stuffed rabbit, and talking at full speed about the dream she'd had, which apparently involved the rabbit fighting a dragon on a bridge made of crackers. Emma listened to every word with her whole attention, and Adrian drove and listened too, and Sophie looked at him in the rearview mirror at a red light and said, "Adrian, in my dream there was a dragon. Were you scared of dragons when you were little?" Adrian considered this. "I was scared of other things," he said. "What things?" "Being alone," he said. Sophie accepted this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has been sick and therefore has thoughts about things that matter. "That's a good thing to be scared of," she said. "Because you don't have to be alone. You just have to find the right people." Emma looked out the passenger window. Adrian looked at the road. Neither of them said anything, but his hand resting on the gear shift moved exactly 2 inches toward hers before he stopped himself. And Emma's hand, he noticed, was exactly 2 inches closer than it had been when they got in the car. They left Sophie with Rosa. On the sidewalk outside Rosa's building, Emma turned to him and said, "Tell me what Tuesday looks like." "A room full of people who want me to apologize for things I'm not sorry for," he said. "And what are you going to do?" "Not apologize," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "What are you sorry for, actually?" He thought about it honestly. "Moving things around without asking," he said. "In the beginning. I handled you like a problem instead of a person, and I didn't realize I was doing it until you told me. I'm sorry for that." Emma nodded slowly. "That's the right answer." "I know." "Don't be smug about knowing the right answer." "I'm not being smug." "Your face is being a little smug." Something happened to his expression that was he suspected the closest thing to a genuine smile he'd produced in years. Emma saw it, and her own expression shifted open slightly the way it did when she let herself stop performing composure and just existed. Go do your meeting, she said. And Adrian? She paused. She pressed her lips together. Then, don't lose yourself in there trying to protect me. I'm not worth you becoming someone different. He looked at her steadily. You're not asking me to become anyone different, he said. You're asking me to be more honest than I've ever been in a boardroom. That's not losing myself. That's the opposite. Emma held his gaze. Then she nodded once with the particular certainty of someone who has decided to believe something and walked back toward Rosa's building, and Adrian watched her go and thought with a clarity that surprised him he was ready. Saturday and Sunday passed in the specific suspended tension of a storm that has been forecast but hasn't arrived. Adrian worked. He prepared. He had 3 conversations with his attorney that lasted a combined 6 hours. He sent Emma one text on Sunday afternoon that said, "Sophie still sleeping okay." She replied, "Fever's gone. She's bossing the rabbit around. We're fine." He looked at that message for longer than was warranted, and then put his phone away and went back to work. On Monday morning, Philip Graves made a mistake. He contacted Emma directly. The message came through the company's internal system at 9:17 a.m., carefully worded, professionally framed. But the content was a threat, dressed in business language. It suggested that Emma might want to consider whether her position at the company was sustainable, given the current, quote, climate of scrutiny, and that there were people who could make certain things significantly more difficult for her if the situation wasn't resolved cleanly. It did not say what those things were. It didn't need to. Emma understood exactly what it meant. She forwarded it to Adrian at 9:19 a.m. with no message attached. He received it at 9:21 a.m. He read it once. Then he called Richard Hale. "Richard," he said, "I need you to do something. I need you to pull all internal communications from Philip Graves for the last 60 days and have them in my hands by end of business today." Silence. "Adrian, that requires board authorization. I have 2 board members who will co-sign the request in the next hour. Do you want their names now, or shall I have them call you directly?" A longer silence. "I'll pull the communications," Hale said. "Thank you," Adrian said. He hung up and immediately called Emma. She answered before the first ring completed. "I got your forward," he said. "He just threatened me through a company channel," Emma said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not fear exactly, more like the specific fury of a woman who has been underestimated one time too many. "He left a paper trail." "I know," Adrian said. "It's the smartest thing he's done for my case." "That's not comforting." "It should be. Graves just handed me everything." A beat. "Emma, I need to ask you something. The message he sent, how are you?" "Not legally, actually." A pause. He heard her exhale. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm so angry, Adrian. I have been careful and professional, and I have done everything right, and this man who has never once noticed I existed is using me as a chess piece, and I am—" She stopped. "I'm really angry." "Good," he said. "Good. Anger means you're not scared," he said. "Scared is harder to work with." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, except tighter. "Don't psychoanalyze me." "I'm not. I'm agreeing with you." A pause. "Sit tight. Tomorrow it ends." "You sound very certain about that." "I am very certain about that." "Adrian?" "Emma." "If this goes wrong, it won't." "But if it does?" "It won't," he said, and then quieter. "Trust me." The 3 seconds of silence that followed were the most significant 3 seconds of the last 4 months. "Okay," she said. Tuesday arrived the way consequential days always do, indistinguishable from any other morning until you're inside it. Adrian arrived at the boardroom 12 minutes early, which was 4 minutes later than he usually arrived for board meetings, because he'd spent those 4 minutes in the hallway outside, reminding himself of something he'd never had to remind himself of before, that he was not here to win. He was here to be true. Those 2 things had always been the same for him, and somewhere in the last several years they had quietly diverged, and today was where they came back together. The room had 14 people in it. 12 board members, Richard Hale and Philip Graves, who was seated at the far end of the table with the composed expression of a man who has prepared for this and believes his preparation was sufficient. Adrian sat down. He looked at the room. He said, "Let's begin." Richard Hale outlined the concerns formally. The salary adjustment, the legal referral, the hospitalization, the perceived conflict of interest, the allegation of misused company resources. He read it into the record carefully, fairly, without embellishment. Adrian listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Hale finished, several board members looked at Adrian with the expectant tension of people waiting to see how a man responds when cornered. He said, "Everything in that report is accurate." The room shifted. "I authorized the salary adjustment," he said. "It was a correction. Emma Brooks was performing at a senior coordinator level while being compensated at a junior one. That's a documentation error I should have caught sooner. If correcting it constitutes misconduct, then every manager in this building who has ever given a deserving employee a raise should be in this room with me." He let that land. "I referred her to our corporate legal team regarding a personal custody matter," he continued. "She was being threatened by someone who understood that legal instability made her a weaker position, and I had a resource she didn't have access to. I used it. I would do it again." He looked directly at Graves. "And I was at the hospital because she was there alone, and that was not acceptable." A board member on his left, a woman named Diane Chen, whom Adrian had respected for 11 years, said carefully, "Adrian, the concern isn't just the individual decisions, it's the pattern. The appearance of a relationship that compromises your judgment." "My judgment has been sound," he said. "Would you like to review the last quarter's decisions? Because I have them. Every partnership call, every budget allocation, every negotiation, would you like to stack them against my track record from the quarters before Emma Brooks was hired?" "I'll wait." Silence. "The pattern you're describing," Adrian said, "is a man who noticed someone in his organization was struggling and decided to help. That is not compromised judgment. That is the minimum standard of human decency." He paused. "The actual pattern worth examining in this room is the one that involves a board member who stands to lose significant personal income from a partnership I declined because it required us to falsify compliance data. That pattern has a name. It's called a conflict of interest. It's called retaliation. And unlike everything in that report, it is actually actionable." He slid a folder to the center of the table. His attorney had prepared it. 60 days of Graves's communications. The SEC referral documentation. The partnership terms with the compliance falsification request highlighted in 3 places. Nobody moved for a full 4 seconds. Philip Graves's composed expression did not break, but something in it recalibrated the specific, almost imperceptible shift of a man who has just realized that the ground he thought was solid has a fault line running through it. "That folder," Adrian said, "was delivered to the SEC this morning at 8 a.m. The copy you have is for your reference." He looked at Graves directly. "I'd recommend you have your personal attorney available this week." The meeting lasted 40 more minutes. It did not go the direction Graves had prepared for. At the end of it, Diane Chen called for a vote on the motion to review Adrian's leadership. The vote was 9-3 in his favor. Graves voted against. The other 2 dissenting votes were men with their own entanglements in the partnership deal that Adrian had now formally placed under regulatory scrutiny. Adrian thanked the room. He gathered his papers. He walked out. In the hallway, Richard Hale caught up with him and said with the bewildered tone of a man who'd watched something happen that he couldn't fully account for, "You knew about Graves before today." "Yes," Adrian said. "You've had this for days." "Yes." "You could have led with it. You could have destroyed him in the first 5 minutes." Adrian buttoned his jacket. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about Emma on her doorstep, saying, "Don't lose yourself in there trying to protect me." He thought about Sophie in the hospital, saying, "You just have to find the right people." He thought about a parking garage and medical bills and 3 words barely above a whisper that had cracked open something inside him that he hadn't known was sealed. Because I needed to say the true things first, he said. And then deal with Graves, not the other way around. Haley looked at him for a moment with an expression Adrian couldn't entirely read. You're different, he said. I know, Adrian said, and walked away. He called Emma from the car. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant everything. Well, she said. 9 to 3, he said. A sharp exhale on her end. And Graves' SEC referral filed this morning. He'll be managing his own situation for the foreseeable future. A pause. He won't be contacting you again. Silence. Then very quietly. Is it over? The board part is over, he said. Daniel is still, we're monitoring. But the lawyer is confident. He has nothing solid, Emma. He was waiting to use Graves' story as leverage, and Graves' story is now extremely complicated for Graves to tell. She said nothing for a moment. He could hear her breathing, and the quality of it had changed the long-held tension, releasing the specific sound of a person who has been carrying something very heavy and has just been told they can set it down. Emma, he said. I'm here, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. Are you okay? She stopped. I'm really okay. I think that's what's getting me. I'm actually okay. He smiled. It was the kind of smile nobody could see, the kind that lived entirely inward. Good, he said. Adrian. A beat. Thank you. You thanked me in the wrong direction, he said. You made me better at this. At all of it. Being a manager, being honest, being... He stopped. Then, being in a room and saying true things instead of strategic things. I didn't know how to do that until I had a reason to learn it. A long silence. Not uncomfortable. Full. Drive safe, she said. I will, he said. Emma. I know, she said, and he believed her. 6 months later, the empire was still standing. Differently, maybe cleaner, leaner, with 3 fewer partnership agreements, and significantly more regulatory cooperation than it had ever had before. The board had restructured. Graves had resigned rather than face what was coming, which was the decision of a man who understood mathematics. 2 other board members had followed shortly after, which simplified things considerably. Adrian's management style had become in professional circles a subject of some discussion. He asked more questions in meetings. He waited to hear the answers. He had fired precisely nobody in those 6 months for anything other than actual cause, which was a departure from his previous record, and the company had, puzzlingly to some analysts, performed better without the culture of fear. People, it turned out, did better work when they weren't terrified. Adrian filed this information under things he should have understood significantly earlier. Emma was still at the company, not on the 3rd floor anymore. She had a different title now, one she'd earned on her own terms, in a process that Adrian had removed himself from, entirely recusing himself from the review committee and letting the outcome be what it would be. She'd been offered the position and accepted it, and come to tell him with the specific expression of someone who wanted to share something with him specifically, which was its own kind of answer to questions that had been open between them for months. They had dinner twice. Walked in the park once, the 3 of them, Adrian and Emma and Sophie, who had named the rabbit captain, and who had begun referring to Adrian with the comfortable familiarity of a child who has decided someone is simply going to be around. He was not sure exactly what he was to Sophie yet, and he was not in a hurry to define it because he was learning slowly and genuinely that the best things did not need to be named to be real. The beach house weekend was Emma's idea. She said Sophie needed ocean air, and she hadn't had a real day off in over a year. Adrian said he knew a place. She said of course he did. He said that was not fair. She said it was entirely fair, and also would he please not burn the eggs this time, which implied a previous egg situation he was still not fully prepared to defend. He cooked breakfast badly. Sophie ran on the sand until she was breathless and then ran some more. Emma sat at the table with coffee and laughed at something Adrian said, genuinely, completely the laugh that came from somewhere unguarded. And the sound of it moved through the small house, like warmth moves through a room, filling the corners, reaching the places that had been cold. He watched her from across the table. This woman who had sat on a concrete floor and whispered her worst fear to nobody, who had eaten crackers at her desk and worked doubles and held her daughter's hand in hospital rooms and carried everything alone and kept going anyway. Who had taken a lawyer's card and a post-it note and folded them both in her pocket like they were worth keeping. Who had stepped forward on her own doorstep and said okay clearly and without flinching and meant it. And he thought about the man he'd been 12 months ago, cold-focused, emotionless in a parking garage, walking toward a black car after dismantling people without feeling a thing. He thought about what it had cost him to be that man, and what it had taken to stop being him, and how it had required not a strategy or a plan, but a woman crying in a parking garage and 3 words that had reached something inside him he hadn't known was still alive. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Emma looked down at their hands, then up at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held his easy and unhurried, the way you hold something you intend to keep. Sophie's voice came through the open door asking about lunch, asking if there were shells she could keep, asking if Captain the Rabbit could come to the beach tomorrow. And Emma called back. That yes, yes, and probably yes. And Adrian sat in a small house with bad cooking and good light, and the sound of a child and a woman who had, without ever trying to build something inside him that all his money and power and controlled precision had never once managed to build. He had spent his whole life constructing an empire. Steel and glass and carefully maintained distance, floor after floor of influence and control, built to last and built to impress and built underneath everything, to make sure that no one could ever reach him in the specific place where he was most afraid of being reached. And the first real home he ever had was her. Not the beach house. Not any house. Her. The way she said his name. The way she held the card he'd given her, and the note she'd never thrown away. The way she stepped forward instead of back and looked at him like the truth of him was not something to be afraid of. He had built an empire. She had given him something it could never buy, never build, never negotiate or acquire or arrange. She had given him back himself. And that steady and real and permanent as anything he'd ever built from steel was the only thing that had ever actually mattered.